Okay, let's get started. So first of all, in case you don't know who I am, I'm Chris Evans. I am, I guess, an analyst, a blogger. I have been a long-time consultant in the industry, and I run a website and a business called Architecting IT. I also run a website called Storage Impact, which is a website for which is basically a site that broadcasts podcasts covering enterprise storage. So we cover all sorts of things from hardware to the operations of storage and so on. I'll share those afterwards for you, but if you just do a search in either Architecting IT or Storage Impact, you'll easily find us. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to look at the mid-range market segment. Now, we'll go into detail as to exactly what mid-range actually means by that definition. But really what we're talking about here is looking at the mid-range hardware products from the major vendors. Now, we're not going to go into a detailed look at speeds and feeds of every single vendor and all the different configurations they offer, because we could be here all day. We could be here for a week, we could be here for a month just talking about that. So what we will do is we'll look at the very top end highlights about what each of the different vendor offers and what their solutions do. We'll also look at things like table stakes. So we'll go in and look at the market and say, when we look at the mid-range platforms, and by platforms, by the way, we mean typically hardware, what are they offering? What do they look like? And how do they all compete against each other? What are we starting to see in terms of commonality and features? As part of that, we'll talk a little bit about the cloud and SDS, although we won't go into that in a great deal of detail. And then there'll be a vendor roundup at the end when we go back and look at these vendors, and we look at them and we have a discussion about the vendors rather than specifically deep diving into their products. And just to remind you, this is a discussion that's covering general purpose and typically block storage, but not exclusively block storage, as we will see when we get into the discussion. Now, I should say before we go any further that this presentation has been derived from freely available materials. So none of the content you'll find here comes from any vendor under NDA. It's all freely available. It's all being taken from websites, from podcasts, from data sheets that are on the internet already. So if you want to go and find this stuff, you can. If you want to come to me and ask me where I got it from, I'm happy to share it. But it's all from online sources. Now, obviously, the problem with that is can't always guarantee that those are entirely accurate. Vendors make mistakes. Vendors refresh their products. So I'm afraid we can't say that this is 100% guaranteed to be accurate. And in fact, even since this presentation was put together, some of the content has changed, and the vendors that we were going to talk about have already released slightly modified products or new features to their products. And naturally, none of this is in any way related to any financial advice. This is really just for your information to help you go off and get an understanding of what vendors are doing in the market. So here's roughly what the agenda will be for this afternoon. What is mid-range storage? Try and get into an idea of understanding what the detail actually is, sort of what the definition of mid-range actually means. We'll then look at the table stakes features, as we've already talked about. We'll look at vendors, and then we'll have some conclusions at the end if we get time. So what is mid-range storage? This is such a wide definition to look at. And I tried to come up with something that I thought would be reasonably accurate. And I would describe it as general purpose, and as it says on the screen there, general purpose data storage appliance that offers capacity and performance which scales from small, medium businesses to the enterprise. And we'll come on and discuss that in a second, but I think as we look at mid-range perhaps was seen as being, and let's look at this slide because this gives us a good example. Mid-range perhaps was looked at as being not as good as enterprise, maybe a cheaper quality, maybe a solution for companies that were a bit tight on budget. And I love this definition that I found from 2003, which goes back and actually talks about how effectively the mid-range platforms were seen as basically not symmetrics, which nowadays we look at and is quite laughable, but really at the time, I guess, we really only saw one or two different architectures, and today we see very many more architectures in the ecosystem. So what do we mean by mid-range in that sense? Well, not monolithic, multi-purpose, low cost, low entry point, general purpose. But I think actually over time, I think we've started to see a modification of the definition of what mid-range means. And I think mid-range has moved on to being much more about the general purpose fits all type enterprise solution rather than it being purely for smaller businesses. That's something we'll get onto in a bit more detail in a moment. However, I did want to introduce a few truisms because I thought these are quite relevant to our discussion today. And the first is to talk about today's hardware. Now, we're probably all aware that hardware has become super cheap and very, very reliable. And in fact, most of the vendors you'll see presented here have started migrating their solutions away from custom hardware, not everybody, but most of them from custom hardware into using generic commodity hardware, because it is so reliable and it's so good these days that you really just don't need to build your own solutions. And that's quite an interesting direction, because even at the enterprise level, we're seeing a similar scenario. Having said that, if we look across the market and we look at, say, SDS, I'm not sure whether we could say SDS is, and that, by that we mean software-defined storage, has really been a success so far. And I still do think that customers like packaged solutions. Now, whether that's software on top of packaged hardware, which we're starting to see now, or whether that's a complete turnkey system on a platform, we are starting to see, we do continue to see packaged solutions in the market. And probably more interestingly, and this is something I think is a trend across the whole of the industry, we're seeing customers moving towards being generalists and not specifically being specialists, especially in storage. I think this is a trend we're going to see across the industry in general, but inevitably we're starting to see the storage people having to have other skills, whether that's the ability to script or to understand other parts of the organization. And also we're seeing things like VMware administrators taking over some of this workload. So they're moving into being storage people as well. And that means we really want solutions that don't have as many what we might call nerd knobs. And I think by that, we really want systems that are maybe self-modifying, autonomic, and can handle a lot of the background requirements themselves without us needing to go in and have to change lots of different parameters and settings. Now, I tried to come up with something that gave us an idea of what historically we've seen as the spectrum of solutions in the market. And this looks very, very basic, I guess, but really this is more of a talking point type diagram, because I think it changes over time, and it has, and it continues to change over time. If we look at the diagram, you can see at the one end we have enterprise, at the other end we have SMB, SME, and somewhere in the middle we have mid-range. And let's face it, the reason it's called mid-range is because it's in the middle. Now, exactly where the boundaries between SMB, SME and enterprise actually lie is difficult to say. But as you'll see as we continue the discussion, I would say these boundaries continue to blur. And I would say that other technologies that are coming into the market are starting to allow the SMB, SME end to creep into mid-range. And I think mid-range is creeping in towards the enterprise. And we're starting to see a push of mid-range into the enterprise. And that enterprise is shrinking, particularly in reference to mainframe, where I think the monolithic high-end enterprise solution still exists. But I think there are more use cases where organizations can start picking out mid-range storage, software solutions, other ways of doing things than just traditional enterprise. So I think that's a trend we're starting to see. So what do we think mid-range solutions should have as characteristics then? Well, firstly, I would say that typically in the market, we see them as being appliance-based. And what we mean by that is the vendor produces a standard form factor that they ship to us, which might come in 1 or 2 different configurations, or even half a dozen configurations, but it's a turnkey appliance. It contains everything. It's got the software installed and ready to run. It's got all the components there, including networking and the storage, all built in. Most of the solutions we see on the market are dual controller design. And by that, we mean they've got 2 separate individual servers that together provide resiliency. So if we see a failure in one controller, the other one takes over. And that allows us to get past, and say 3 nines, 4 nines of availability into something much more reliable. Because this is mid-range technology, we see a significantly wide range of scalability options, because we want to be able to support the low end to the high end. So we see systems that are tens or maybe less than 100 terabytes, scaling all the way up to multi-petabytes or petabyte range solutions easily. And that's quite an interesting setup to look at, because it's unusual to see anything that scales from that wide a range and still has to support a wide diversity of customers. So we're talking about supporting customers that might be small enterprises that just have one system, up to organizations that have dozens of systems, or even hundreds of systems, depending on your scalability. And that's quite interesting, simply because that makes it challenging for the vendor to work out how they're going to build solutions and features that allow them to support that range of scalability. But that's a requirement those vendors have got to put in. They've somehow got to scale these solutions quite wide. Now, we've already talked about the hardware being an appliance, but I think we're seeing much more generic hardware these days, generic hardware and servers. Now, it isn't a surprise that a lot of the solutions on the market come from vendors that already sell server hardware. So we see Dell, we see HPE selling their own servers, which are then packaged into storage solutions. And that's not a bad thing. It's the way the market's gone, but that typically is the way that we're seeing it go. And interesting, you'll see when you look across the range of all the different product offerings, most of them look pretty much the same. Most of them are designed around the idea of a shelf of disks, which is integrated into a single chassis with two controllers that sit behind that. And out of those controllers, you've got your networking and your other connectivity. And that's pretty much a standard design nowadays, which is interesting to see how that's developed. Now, as part of this, within the mid-range environment, you would expect to see many protocols being supported, and typically we obviously do have block and file. Now, not every platform supports file, but most of them do. And in terms of block, most of them are going to be supporting iSCSI or fiber channel. We're not yet seeing a lot of NVMe, and I don't necessarily think in this market there's particularly high demand for NVMe, but obviously there is a demand for file in terms of NAS and SAN. Sorry, NAS and SMB. The interesting thing about the multi-protocol side is that we don't really see any object storage built into these platforms. And I say object storage at the moment, but I suspect that that might be something that changes, because as we start to see object storage adopted more rapidly and more readily across smaller organizations, we may well see solutions that come to the market and start offering object storage built in. And obviously, within all of the mid-range side of the house, there's definitely a sensitivity towards price. In my experience, customers are very, very sensitive towards spending anything more than they ever have to. And as part of that spending, they want to be able to look at the architecture and say, I only want to add a little bit of additional capacity, rather than have to put in hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds worth of equipment. So they're both price sensitive, and they're looking to have solutions that are very much dedicated to allowing them to expand in small increments. So let's just talk about trends, and some of these trends we've already highlighted, but I think they're quite interesting to just re-emphasize and go over again. First of all, there's the discussion about standard form factors, and we're seeing a lot of standardization on a form factor that looks like an enclosure with either 24 or 25 drive bays at the front. These are either NVMe or SAS, or could take both. And we're starting to see protocols like U3, which will allow us to hot swap these drives over time. The server form factor is usually 1U or 2U, so drives are either mounted vertically or horizontally, but it's pretty standard design, and I think that's obviously something where we see the server manufacturers coming in and building solutions around. The next point I highlighted on here, which I think is really quite an interesting one, is the idea of single solution software. Now, what do we mean by single solution software? If you look at some architectures, and we'll get into the detail of it, some vendors have basically pulled together portfolios of technology, whereas other vendors have started to standardize and make their operating system, their storage operating system, consistent across their platform. So as examples, Hitachi have got SVOS, Pure have got Purity. IBM recently have changed to have flash system, which is based on Spectrum Virtualize. They did have a different platform for different products recently, but they've standardized. And of course, NetApp for most solutions have got ONTAP. We're starting to see the evolution of all flash and SCM come into these products. And that's quite an interesting trend because it hasn't been as fast, I don't think, as the enterprise. So solutions have started to talk about NVMe, but NVMe is not widespread in this environment. And certainly SCM isn't. And SCM is is storage class memory or persistent memory, typically Intel Optane. What that does is it gives us super high performance capabilities and allows us to either plug devices into an NVMe port or plug it into the system as memory. That's quite I guess, quite an enterprise style adoption of the technology at the moment. But we are starting to see these technologies come in, and we'll discuss exactly where they're being applied as we get to the vendors. Another thing that's really quite an interesting development is the change in consumption models. We'll discuss this in a little more detail, but really this means rather than going out and acquiring the technology by buying it outright, you're looking at maybe leasing, maybe buying as a service, maybe just paying for the capacity that you're using. And that really, I think, is a counter to the cloud and to the cloud consumption model where people can go on and use storage as they need and then switch it off. It's a bit of a challenge, and we'll discuss that in more detail in a slide or two in the future ahead of here. But actually, it's an interesting development to see how that's gone. And finally, there's the subject of enhanced analytics. And by this we mean really the ability to take data from the systems, analyze it off board, maybe in the cloud or at the provider's offices, and then give you feedback on your system that basically allows you to monitor it more effectively and keep the system up at a higher level of nines than you would do otherwise. And those technologies are quite interesting. We have some slides on that in a second when we talk about AI ops. So if those are the trends, where are we heading in terms of table stakes features? What should we expect mid-range products to have? Now, I think quite a few of these we've already discussed, and I think we will go over them again very quickly where we've already talked about them before. But I think if you're in the lower end of the market, you particularly do want multi-protocol support that supports both file and block. And we are seeing a wide range of offerings there. But I do think that if you're a smaller customer, you'll want the ability to put file and block on the same physical platform. Now, as you get to a larger environment, and especially as you start to creep towards the enterprise, that desire to mix and match probably is less popular. But obviously, when you start looking at things like edge and branch and distributed deployments, the ability to mix protocols becomes quite useful. Then we have scale up and scale out configurations, and a lot of these are typically federated in the environments we see, but clearly scale up gives us the ability to add capacity. Scale out gives the ability to scale the systems to add both performance and capacity. And then there's multiple media choices. We talked about this already to a certain degree, but an interesting trend is the fact that we're seeing systems that are coming to the market that are all flash or even all NVMe. We're seeing hard drives still in the market, but just less and less of that, and that's an interesting approach. Naturally, we want hybrid and all-flash offerings, and that comes into media choice. But I think we should expect, and we're starting to see, cloud integration in certain degrees. So some of that might be the ability to archive data into the cloud as a backup. But increasingly, and when we look at, say, NetApp in this particular aspect, there's the start of the ability to build a fabric that spans both on-premises and the cloud. And that could be an interesting model for the future as people start to look further at how they actually use the cloud more effectively. Naturally, we want data protection and resiliency features. So that might well be multi-node, the dual controller configurations we talked about, but obviously RAID. And that RAID nowadays should not be fixed. It should be very dynamic. We should just let that work behind the scenes. We shouldn't have to do anything in order to get that working. And then that takes us to ease of use and automation. And this is a really fascinating area which we could spend, all day talking about, to be honest. But ultimately, we're starting to see a transition away from the specialist to the generalist. And as we move towards the generalist and we start seeing the need to deliver self-service, we're expecting our platforms to allow us to do management and provisioning and reporting through APIs and CLIs. So we'll start to see, and we are seeing, a lot more integration with other platforms like Terraform, Ansible, or even just general scripting that allows administrators to provision storage and to report on that system. We talked about analytics. I think that's a given, and purchasing models and platform consistency. So a lot of the things that we've started to talk about in terms of trends, we're starting to see, I think, as table stakes. So let's just take a moment and just ask a simple question as we look at this market, and just challenge the question as to whether we think we need to implement end-to-end NVMe. Now, what do we mean by that? So the move towards NVMe has allowed us to start moving away from traditional storage protocols like SAS and SATA. NVMe is directly connected to the PCIe bus within the server. So the upshot of that is that we get high performance, we get much lower latency, and that translates directly into performance that the end user and the application sees. That's a good thing, clearly. But on the other side of that, from an internal device perspective, there is a cost factor still at the moment, even though it's the same devices, there's still a cost factor involved. Because we're sitting on the PCIe bus, there is an issue of expandability. The reason for that is traditionally, if you had a storage controller in place like SAS, you would have the ability to connect hundreds of drives. When you look at an NVMe system, you typically see only the first 20, 24 drives connected as NVMe, and all of the expansion shells still as SAS. So the capacity and the expandability issues are probably still there with internal NVMe. Then there's a question about whether you need NVMe at the front end, and NVMe at the front end means NVMe over fabrics to replace your fiber channel or your iSCSI protocols. And I think we're really not seeing the adoption of that yet. We're seeing some vendors bring fiber channel, FCNVMe as it's called, NVMe over fiber channel to the market, but we're not seeing a widespread adoption of that technology yet. So I think we've still got a way to go before NVMe is in the market, but it's a slow, gradual step forward towards that. So I would suggest that we would expect our vendors to be telling us how they support NVMe and what their roadmap is. And if they haven't got a roadmap, that's going to be a problem. But I don't think NVMe is massively adopted in the market yet. So let's go and spend a couple of slides talking about consumption models. This is really, I think, come about simply because we've had a need to try and counter the draw of public cloud. Public cloud has made consumption really easy. It's given us the speed of adoption, I guess, in terms of we can spin up a virtual machine, we can attach some storage, or we can set up a bucket of object storage. We could do that in a few minutes, and then we can turn it off and away we go. Deploying technology on premises has been much more difficult than that because we've tended to have to plan up front. We tended to have to buy the entire platform outright, or maybe we lease it. And over time, of course, storage capacity never decreases, and we see a gradual increase in that usage. So inevitably, we're continually deploying and installing new solutions and new hardware. The consumption models are attempting to try and address the cloud-like requirement that customers have. And I guess you can look at it in a number of ways. I've picked 4 styles of purchase just as examples. And these are really based on existing models, but the sort of things we're starting to see vendors bring into the market. So we could just buy the solution outright as a capital purchase. Many people are probably not going to do that. They're probably going to go and look at some sort of lease model where, although it looks like a purchase, they're actually putting finance in place. But ultimately, you're looking after that, you're managing it, it's on your site, it's all under your control. As we move towards the idea of consumption or utility and consumption as a service, bit by bit, we're taking the opportunity of pushing some of that responsibility off to the vendor. Now, that might be vendor designed or vendor supported, but ultimately what we're saying is we don't really want to actually manage this hardware anymore. And if we're moving towards a model where we've got generalists, that's a good reason why. But what we want to do is we want to push some of the responsibility off to our vendor. And now the vendor takes responsibility and ownership for sharing the cost, sharing the risk, sharing the management. And as a customer now, I do less of that, and I get the benefit of what looks like a service in terms of consumption. So I only pay when I start to use that capacity. I personally think that these are useful for some customers, but really you have to look at your purchasing model, how quickly you're deploying new technology, how quickly you're likely to use it, how comfortable you are with deploying the technology, how comfortable you are with managing it yourself, and if you can really actually get some benefit out of pushing some of that to the vendor. Because ultimately, in order to make this work, the vendor's got to put equipment on your data center that you're not going to initially use and they can't give to anybody else. So you're going to pay a small premium for the use of these services, and as a result, you need to make sure that you feel that that premium is worth it in terms of the way that you consume your storage. So who's doing these solutions? Here's an example of some of them. Every vendor's got one. There is a Dell offering as well, which I haven't added in there, but you can see that NetApp have got Keystone. Hitachi brought out something called Everflex recently. HP, you're trying to push the GreenLake model, which is their overall solution for selling everything as a service. Pure Storage originally had Evergreen. IBM has a solution called FlashWatch. So all of the vendors are doing it. All of the vendors are looking to try and change the model and give you something that allows you to be more flexible with your consumption. As part of this, we see that vendors are offering included upgrades. So every so often your hardware gets upgraded, and that might be the controller, or it might be an entire refresh of the entire platform, but it allows you to keep the platform up to date, running with the latest hardware, and potentially expanding to take or to manage the capacity that you need. I really don't have time to go into the detail of every single one of these solutions because there's a huge number. It's a subject perhaps in its own right to go into, but it's worth looking at if you really feel that you have a need to have a different consumption model. But really look at the detail, because I don't think all of these vendors have fully fleshed out exactly what they want them to look like yet. They all operate in different ways, and it will be a bit like buying a mobile phone tariff. You won't be entirely sure whether they're all compatible or equal to each other. So let's move on and talk about AI ops and why we need this in our environment. Now, we talked about the idea of analytics and about the idea of taking data from the systems that helps us understand exactly what's going on and improving the resiliency of our platform. AI ops is a definition. I think it's a Gartner definition, and it basically talks about automation, performance management, and service management. And the aim is to augment the human in the process in order to allow us to manage scale. If you think about where we are today to where we were, say, 30 years ago, we're expecting our storage administrators and our generalists now to administer petabytes of capacity each. And doing that is difficult unless you've got some sort of automation, some sort of additional data that allows you to extract that and to take that data and do something with it. So we see within those three disciplines, the collection of data being important, the processing of that data in real time, the applicability of rules and patterns to that data to highlight maybe potential problems or trends or faults that we might be seeing in the system. And as part of that, we have both domain algorithms and automation to allow us to correct them. So some vendors will actually come in and say, will give you a solution which will actually automatically fix your problems for you. I think AI apps is really interesting and really important because as we go further into the management of technology, we're going to have to automate so much more, simply because we won't be able to deal with the scale of it. And also because no one person can understand the detail of how all of this technology works. A single person can't know the entire configuration, and they certainly can't get data out of a platform and analyze it in real time as fast as an AI algorithm or a piece of machine learning could do. So who's doing this today? Well, surprise, surprise, everybody's doing it today. Dell EMC have got Cloud IQ and Data IQ. Data IQ is a new offering which looks at the actual data, whereas Cloud IQ is about understanding your physical environment. Hitachi have some features in Ops Center, although I do think that's probably in all of this list the weakest of the offerings available. HPE probably led and still leads the market with InfoSight. This came from the Nimble acquisition, and the more I see about what they're doing with this and the way they're spreading it across not just the storage deployments, but they're pushing this out to servers, to HCI, and to other areas. InfoSight is a real focus for HPE, and people say that's one of the reasons why they bought Nimble. Whether they did or they didn't, I couldn't say, but it is a core component for their systems, and it does provide some significant value. I have a few blog posts and I've done some podcasts on it, so that's one of the things I'll add into to the notes that I issue at the end of this, which will give you some links to some of the things that I've actually written on this subject. NetApp have Active IQ, excuse me, and you may well know that NetApp have had auto support for years. I mean, literally 20 plus years since the products were first developed. So NetApp have a really powerful set of solutions out there for this. So, you know, they've been in the market for a long time, and they definitely have the solutions that are really mature as well. And then Pure have got Pure One. Pure One is the Pure equivalent of the analytic solutions. Pretty much all of these work by collecting data, putting it into the cloud, and then taking that data, analyzing it, and then taking the results and using that results back on your system. So it's almost like a wisdom of the crowd type offering, which is quite clever, really. Actually, it works really well. I would expect every vendor to have this going forward, because at the end of the day, if they don't, they're going to lose out, because this is something that the cloud providers the cloud service providers will easily be able to put in their environments. And without a doubt, they already do. So I would expect that we'll see just further and further improvement and development of these technologies as we go forward. Let's quickly talk about the impact of the cloud, and then we'll dive into talking about some vendors. So what has the cloud done to change vendors' approach in the way that we look at, say, mid-range storage? And I think, first of all, I think it's forced vendors to add more value to their platforms. And what do we mean by more value? Well, it's some of the things we've already talked about. It's being that complete Swiss Army knife, which has the ability to deploy in many different ways, to be automated, to have AI in there to keep the resiliency in place, the new purchasing models. All of this is really, I think, come from a desire to try and counter the way that cloud is operating. And the problem, of course, is just that cloud's just so adoptable, and that's difficult really to counter. Now, probably the best approach, if we look at the market, is not to actually fight the cloud, but it's to work with it. So some vendors have already started putting virtual instances of their solutions in the cloud. Some vendors like NetApp have started to put fully integrated solutions into the cloud. And that means they've actually taken their solutions and they've integrated it natively within the cloud environment. So you see that with Azure NetApp Files. But other vendors are starting to do that too, because clearly there's an understanding that hybrid model will work so much better if you've got the same look and feel and the ability to share data between on and off premises. I think with all of this, there's the issue of the innovator's dilemma. the fact that SMB, SME products at the bottom end are getting so much better. Now, I'm not going to go into competitors in this one because I don't think we'll have time today, but ultimately, if you look at the way that the market's changing, the SMB products are absolutely fantastic. They're adding features, they're adding functionality, and a lot of the software solutions, like if you look at, say, TrueNAS, are coming along and they're fully featured and really, really mature. So I think there's a risk that the vendors are going to be attacked from the lower end, both from a SaaS perspective for people who might move data to the cloud, but also the quality of those products. Okay, now let's move on and talk about some vendors in the last section of the discussion. I've taken these in order, and we're just going to look at 6 vendors, the main vendors in the market. They're in alphabetical order. So if you're a vendor on the call looking at this, thinking, why have you gone first? It's because it's alphabetical order. So let's talk about Dell. I'm not sure whether these days whether we're supposed to say Dell EMC or Dell Technologies, but let's call it Dell EMC. Dell has quite a range of products. There's PowerStore, which is the new solution. There's the historical Unity, which was VNX, originally Clarion, from the acquisition of Data General, which is the end of the millennium. There was Extreme IO, which was acquired in 2012. And there was also the SC series, which came from the Compellent acquisition in 2010. I've tried to show on a little timeline there exactly how the acquisitions have translated and changed the products and changed the company. But you'll see that over time, Clarion became the dominant platform in the form of Unity. But now we're expecting PowerStore to be the replacement for that. So what does PowerStore look like? Well, it's a dual controller architecture, pretty standard, active-active, both scale up and scale out. And looking at the design, it looks like it's federated. And by that, what we mean is we can scale it out, but we scale out with nodes that manage individual volumes or LUNs. We're not spreading the data across every single node at the same time. Platform is offering NVMe support, but only in the main chassis. It has expansion capability, which is SaaS. But obviously, it does support a wide range of SSDs and a wide range of capacities. Now, I'll let you read the rest of that because I'd like to just talk generally about this platform before we go any further. It's interesting to see that there are 5 models, all of which have the same capacity in terms of storage, but vary in terms of the amount of memory and the amount of cores that they support. And the reason for this is because there are 2 models available. There's one that runs purely as a storage system, and there's one that runs as an integrated, almost like an HCI model, but basically is running embedded ESX, VMware ESX, so you can run applications on the platform. Whether that's a good idea remains to be seen. It's been tried before. I'm not sure whether it'll be successful this time, but clearly Dell are hoping that this will have some sort of future. We'll see. So what do we think the strategy is from Dell's perspective? Well, clearly there is a desire to get from 4 platforms down to 1. And as part of that, everything's being moved towards the Power brand name. So we've now got PowerStore, PowerScale. We've got other products which are coming up, I'm sure, which are going to use the same brand name. But this rebranding and this new platform is really also about introducing new technology like NVMe. Now, it looks like I'm being slightly negative on Dell here, but I apologize if it seems like that because it's not entirely negative. But here are some of the challenges I think that are going to come from that migration from 4 platforms into 1. There's a lot of work still to come yet around retiring legacy platforms. And we've been told that the legacy platforms aren't necessarily going to be closed down initially. So they might still be around for a little while. PowerStore is a new platform, so we really need to see that tested in the market first. And that applies both to resiliency and feature completeness. I'm not saying that it isn't a good product, but obviously as soon as you go from deploying a few hundred systems to a few thousand, you start finding corner cases that you really want to make sure you're on top of. So many customers might look at it and say, I'll wait a little bit and see whether I'm really happy that this platform is good. I would imagine Dell will be doing exactly the opposite and will be basically white gloving their service to make sure customers take this platform. So we'll see how that turns out. But one of the things that I think the two models really becomes a challenge with here is that Dell almost seems to be competing with itself, because there are already internal platforms like VxRail, and I think it would be good to understand exactly how the two of those will be marketed, because customers might struggle to see that. And finally, there is not a hybrid solution going forward. This will be an NVMe and a flash only solution, and Unity will be retained for hybrid. Now that was done at the high end as well, and that may be a bold move, which is fair enough, but there will definitely be customers who don't want to do that. So exactly how that will play out will be interesting, but we'll see how that goes. Let's now talk about Hitachi Vantara. Now Hitachi have a range of products all based around the VSP name, Virtual Storage Platform. This is a single operating system, and we saw a new model, the VSP E990, introduced only a couple of months ago, which is a mid-range all NVMe platform. Again, this is an interesting move that we're seeing the vendors wanting to move to all NVMe or all flash solutions. Whether customers are ready for that, who knows? But obviously there are other options available in the Hitachi marketplace. You can take the G series, which is hybrid, and then the older solution is the F series, but that's also targeted at the enterprise. The E990, we'll just discuss that very briefly. Dual controller, scale-up architecture, pretty much standard, ticks all the boxes that we'd expect to see on all of the requirements we talked about at the very beginning. The interesting thing is here, of course, there's no file support. So this is a block solution, and that may or may not change, but that is obviously a differentiation when you look at other platforms and other solutions in the market. Not sure exactly whether that's good or bad, but there are other options in Hitachi's stable for that. So what can we say about Hitachi in terms of strengths and weaknesses? Well, definitely there's strong hardware engineering. If you look at the way that box has been built, there's a lot of new hardware engineering gone into that. There's consistent management across all platforms, and it is a super high performance, low latency box, probably the lowest latency of all the solutions we've seen. However, I do think Hitachi has a weaker story on AI and the analytics side. I don't think they're doing as much of extracting data and putting it in the cloud. And of course, they are block only. So there's still some issues around how that will work. Next, we'll have a look at HPE. HPE have got, well, an incredibly diverse range of products. We are probably all familiar with 3PAR, the 3PAR StoreServe platform, which came from the acquisition of 3PAR in 2010. That is classed as a tier 1 box, as is the Nimble storage box, which came from the Nimble acquisition in 2017. Both of those platforms have all flash versions, and they also have hybrid versions. And at the higher end above that, HP brought out a new solution called Primera, which is not 3PAR, but obviously has heritage 3PAR design in there and is classed as a tier 0 solution. Now, I find that an interesting definition that they call it tier 0, because it is not an all-flash box. It will run SSDs and hard drives in the same infrastructure. So calling it tier 0 probably is true if you look at the solution as all flash, but I don't think it is if you treat it as a hybrid box. Then at the lower end, you've got the MSA. Interestingly, from HP's design, both of their offerings, all of their offerings, except the MSA, are all multi-controllers. So they're either multi-controller or dual controller with scale up, scale out in the case of Nimble. There's a wide support for NVMe, SAS, and SCM. And in fact, SCM was just brought out on the Nimble platform this week as a cache using Optane to improve performance. I think, in fact, it was announced yesterday or today at HP Discover. Primera was also upgraded to include NVMe, which it didn't have initially. And this is probably the area looking at their technology that I'm probably a little bit confused about, because initially it was said that we didn't really need NVMe for performance on the Primera platform, but now NVMe is supported. I'm still trying to get to the bottom of that question and understand that in a bit more detail, but I really haven't sort of found an answer to that. So I think if we look at where HPE is probably headed, I think the intention will be that 3PAR will be sunset, Primera becomes the T0, Nimble becomes tier 1. We start to see the new technologies come in place. Primera is modified to be more dynamic. It includes microservices in the architecture. So obviously it's got higher uptime, it's more autonomic. So there's a lot more of the intelligent storage message in there, the use of InfoSight. So going forward, HPE have got a strong portfolio, I think, in terms of their technologies. The challenge will be how they get people moving away from 3PAR and using the other platforms. But I think a strong platform there. One final point on the HPE side, they are still using custom ASICs. Is that still a good idea in 2020? In fact, fun enough, it might still look like a good idea in 2020 because we're starting to see new solutions that are coming to the market that are starting to use custom hardware again. So actually, that might not be a problem going forward. IBM. Now, IBM have refreshed their mid-range solutions, all now called Flash System, all now based on Spectrum Virtualize, which was the old SVC. Storewise brand has been dropped, and those lines are being EOL'd. So everything is now based on one single operating system platform. There are 3 family groups, the 5000, 7000, and 9000, all of which give different levels of scalability, different levels of support for different pieces of media. But looking across the board, it's difficult to find any real problems with the IBM architecture in general. It seems to tick all the boxes. It supports lots of different media. It scales out. It's dual controller, but there is clustering and federation in there at the higher end. It supports NVMe and SAS. IBM have their own custom hardware for Flash called Flash Core, which gives them some advantages in terms of capacity. So as a general system, Flash System seems to have come together to be a reasonable platform. The only negative here really I can think of with IBM is whether Spectrum Virtualize is the weak point, having been the platform they've focused on. It's difficult to say. Spectrum Virtualize has been around for a while. There's been a lot of work going on it. It's at least 20 years old, so it's had a lot of development. So it's not a bad product per se, but that is probably the only thing I can pick out as a weak point in that solution. NetApp. Now, NetApp has got quite a range of products. As we already know, there's ONTAP, which is in multiple different flavors, the E series, and then the SolidFire. And I would suggest that ONTAP is probably the main platform for mid-range. As we probably know, it's both a scale out and a scale up architecture. It's a clustered federated design, so you scale up in clustered node pairs. There are now all flash versions. There's now NVMe versions of the solution, and NetApp have been very careful to point out that they were one of the first vendors to bring end-to-end NVMe to the market. And by that, we mean NVMe at the back end of the platform and NVMe as a front-end protocol. For the ONTAP solutions, there's ONTAP, there's FAS, and there's AFF, and there's also a SAN-only solution, but actually it does support a wide range of protocols. It's probably I wouldn't say the most fully featured in terms of protocol support, but it's probably the one we look at and we think of as being the most broad in terms of supporting both file and block at the same time. Where's NetApp going to head? Well, it's difficult to see. I mean, I would say that their focus is good on the cloud integration side and where they're pushing that. They've certainly tried to standardize on using Flash and NVMe and introduce that as new technology. The question is, what do we do with E-Series and SolidFire? Do these keep going separately, or are these likely to be rolled in or consolidated in? I'm not sure I really know the answer to that, but I think those are probably hitting completely different markets and are not really mid-range. So SolidFire is more targeted at the service provider market, whereas E-Series is certainly there for high end and is used on the object storage platform. So I suspect those will all be kept separate, and we'll see those separate, and that will be the way that will be run. And finally, we'll talk about Pure Storage. So Pure developed their solution as a custom hardware, custom flash module package. It actually wasn't custom flash in the very beginning, but direct flash was developed and brought into the platform a few years ago, and now excuse me, is the main way that the flash is deployed in that solution. So it's NVMe, it's native NVMe, it's a single platform, and it scales from the X10 all the way up to the X90, the X10 being entry level, and there is a number of other models in between that scale that from 73 terabytes on the X10 all the way up to 3.3 petabytes at the high end. So they offer quite a wide range of scalability, but more importantly, within each of those products, you can move between generations and you can upgrade to each of those different solutions non-disruptively. And you can do that simply by unplugging and replugging the controllers, and if you need to, the media. So it's completely upgradable in place. I would say, looking across the feature set, the solution pretty much ticks every box that you would expect. It's got compression, it's got dedupe, it's got all of the things that we've already talked about. But perhaps what isn't there for the mid-range market yet is well, let's take a step back and just think about the file support first of all. File support has been added in with a recent announcement, so there is that support. But the cloud support looks to me to be much more like an enterprise feature. So I'm not sure whether the cloud support is entirely the way that we would want it at the moment. Let's just summarize that by looking at this final page. So single hardware design, custom flash design, file support is in place. One other thing to point out, this might not be a mid-range offering, but Pure does have both the X and the C models. The X models are what you might class as performance, and C models are using much bigger capacity flash drives, and therefore are built more around capacity than pure performance. I don't think that's a mid-range offering because you're looking at up to a petabyte deployed for that in one hit. It's not really a mid-range solution, but it is there if people want it. Two questions around Pure really. First of all, will they produce an SCM-based solution, and will they introduce tiering? So the current tiering plan is to have two platforms, the X and the C, and they're very much against the idea of tiering. But I wonder, as we get into having more different types of media, whether that will become a requirement. Now, SCM has been introduced in a limited way as a cache, so it's not a tier, it's a cache. So there's some movement there, but I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens on that one. But certainly quite a well featured product. Now, I just wanted to go back to the final slide here and talk about where we see the future. And we could annotate this slide, I guess, a lot more and look at other pieces to it. But I do think mid-range is bigger and wider than probably it's ever been. And it's starting to see wider support in the marketplace. Now, we haven't talked about other vendors out there, but you could look at Tintree, you could look at the way Store One is bringing their technology to the market. I think we'll continue to see mid-range change, and mid-range is almost becoming the new enterprise. Enterprise is almost being pushed away to being the mainframe solution. I also think that at the lower end, we've got SMB and SME. There's also the cloud impact here. And we haven't even talked about SDS. So, and SDS tends to be more like a mid-range solution anyway. So I think in the future, we'll see mid-range widen, become more important to the market. I think we'll see it being the dominant on-premises hardware deployment that we'll use. And I think we'll start to see the enterprise shrink and become niche a bit like the mainframe has. And with that, that concludes our presentation for today. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm just going to have a quick check to see if there are any questions or there's anything that people have added to the chat. So Okay, I've just had one bit of feedback, and that's to say that we're not sure whether NetApp have released NVMe on the front end yet on the AFF, but it is due out at some point. You could be right. I'd have to go back and double check, but I'll just say that, Neil, thanks very much for answering that. But thank you for joining today. I'll make sure that I send out the recording so you'll be able to follow up on this. I'll also send out some links and some details, and I'll be grateful for any feedback you have on the content and on whether you'd like to see future presentations. But for now, thank you.